Hello, good morning, everybody. Today we are going to be continuing with our Global Contemporary unit. This week we have 3 more videos. This is the first, so this is for Monday, 4th video in the total series. And today we're going to be talking about looking at ourselves as others see us. So all of these artists are looking at their own identity, some piece of it, through the lens of other people. So just to continue from before, we have similar essential points and historical context. Feel free to review. But today, as I said, we're looking at ourselves as others see us. So as we go through these artists, I want you to think about how your own perceptions of others impact your reactions to the work. So each of us have our own lens, depending on where we were raised, the religion that we were a part of, our cultural background, any traditions. All of those things impact how we live our lives and how we experience artworks, how we experience other people. And so just kind of keep that in mind as you look at these artists. We have 4 today we're covering, and these are some of my favorite artists. We have Horn Players by Jean-Michel Basquiat, Dancing at the Louvre by Faith Ringgold, Trade, Gifts for Trading Land with White People by John Quick-to-See Smith, and Rebellious Silence by Shirin Neshat. So without further ado, let's get started. This is actually a really interesting time to be covering Basquiat. If you look, he was working mostly in the 80s, started in the 70s, but really became more famous in the 80s. And when you look at his work, what you might notice right off the bat is there's kind of fractured elements that you can kind of put together. You might see human elements, but you also see a lot of text. You see things that are kind of crossed out, written over and over again. It's a little bit chaotic and really dark background and then bright paints on the surface. He's using paint stick on top of these 3 panels to create this work. And he's calling it Horn Players. We're actually looking at some musicians here. But first, let's kind of look at it in response to, this is a piece by Picasso with 3 musicians in it. Basquiat was somebody who never went to art school, was completely self-taught, but he was really aware of art history, music history, just really had a strong sense of what was going on with the pulse of music and art. And so he used that to kind of influence what he did. And so definitely looking at Picasso, looking at abstract expressionists as inspiration for his works. All right, continuing on. So he is known for not only creating visual interpretations, but also using a lot of language in what he writes. We talked about the color, the figures, the crossing out of words. And the 2 artists or musicians in this work that he's highlighting are Dizzy Gillespie, who's a famous trumpeter, and then we also have Charlie Bird Parker, which is a famous saxophonist from his time period. And Charlie was known as Bird, so that's why we have ornithology, the study of birds, written over and over again. So this is something, it's kind of like a play on his nickname. Basquiat was very playful, kind of humorous in the way that he approached some of his content. We also have words written. These were a daughter and a wife of one of the individuals. And his point in pieces like this, he was trying to honor and celebrate some of his Black heroes, but also the energy in this canvas, the fact that we have things that don't always make sense. There's a lot of rhythmic movement between the darks and the lights. We have a lot of chaos. He's trying to reflect some of the energy of New York City in the 80s and the time that he's living. And also the rhythms in jazz music. Both of them are hugely influential in his work, and he's trying to get you to feel some of that chaos when you're looking at his piece. He was born in Brooklyn to a middle-class family. He didn't really get along with his family too well. They had different values than he had, so he did leave home, and he became a street artist for the first period of his life as a teenager. And he had the name, his tag name was Samo. It's a play on the derogatory term SAMBO, which is used for a lot of indigenous people and then also came to be used for a lot of African Americans. So he's using this kind of negative piece of his background as an African American male and then turning it into something and kind of identifying with it, taking ownership of it. He was also really influenced by, and this is a really timely thing, especially considering what's happening right now in our culture with George Floyd and the riots that we've seen. It's kind of sad that it's been going on for this long. But in 1983, there was the death of a young black artist, a street artist, who he knew in New York City, and the artist was in police custody when he died. And this greatly influenced and made him want to create art, brought a lot of anger to his pieces, thinking about his own identity, thinking about how close to him something like that was, because this was another young black street artist, just like he is at the time. And that kind of makes him jolt his art forward, trying to really speak out about his beliefs. Basquiat was always very critical of the art world. He wasn't really accepted during his lifetime for most of the time that he was working. He was considered more of a street artist and wasn't really taken seriously. And then unfortunately, he dies very young at age 27 of a heroin overdose. So we really don't know the full potential that was Basquiat, but really influential in his styling and also the messaging, especially when you think of how it has related to our current culture and still some of the things that are going on. So a little bit more about him. One of his quotes is, "Believe it or not, I can actually draw." So he could make art in a lot of different styles, but he just preferred this kind of energetic, angry imagery in the way that he created his works. Here he's shown with Andy Warhol. They had an entire show together. Andy Warhol was a huge fan of Basquiat's, and they really work together well, and there's some beautiful, beautiful works out there of them in combination if you want to look up more. Just a couple more by Basquiat so you get a better feeling of his work. This one is called Hollywood Africans, and then this one was called Untitled. And this was one of his biggest sellers. This sold for over a couple $1,000,000, I believe, but really, really impressive just in the fastness, the rhythmic color application. You kind of feel that city aggression and energy when you look at his pieces. And then I thought this was kind of an interesting point. An interviewer asked Basquiat in 1983, which was the year that he did Horn Players, if there was anger in his work. And he said it's about 80% anger. So when we go back to our initial question of how do your own perceptions of others impact your reaction to the work, Basquiat is using those interpretations of him, seeing him as an African American, using the language related to his own heritage to kind of make you think about his lens and who he is as a person. All right, moving on, we're going to look at Dancing at the Louvre. This is from the French collection, so she did a whole series called the French collection with the same storyline, and this is part one. So Faith Ringgold is an artist who is known for making quilts into high art. So previously, quilting was considered a women's craft, folk art, not really taken seriously. But here we have her actually exhibiting in galleries and museums. She actually turns it into more of a high art form. And this quilt in the center panel, that is painted acrylic on canvas, and then it's quilted and added with this floral border, and there's also narrative written in this part here. And then there's batting between the layers, just like a typical quilt, and then there would be a backing. And the lines that you see across are how it all stays together. So she's elevating quilting and putting it into a museum. So this is just the beginning of the story from the quilt, but I think it's worthwhile reading. There's a ton of text here, and I'll kind of talk about the story more. So, dear Aunt Melissa, Marcia and her 3 little girls took me dancing at the Louvre. I thought I was taking them to see the Mona Lisa. You've never seen anything like this. Well, the French hadn't either. Never mind Leonardo da Vinci and Mona Lisa. Marcia and her 3 girls were the show. They ran me ragged, Marcia, wanting to go one way and the children another. Marcia wanted to go one way and the children another. The baby girl wanted to jump. The other 2 wanted to run and did. Then they all just broke into a dance when we finally found the Mona Lisa. So it's just the beginning of the story, but you can see we have a mother and her friend, and we have these three girls that are just dancing and having a great time in the Louvre, right in front of the Mona Lisa and some other paintings that are there. So let's break it down a little more, what's going on here. So we talked about the form of the piece and how it's canvas, it's a painting that she does, and the quilting. This is the beginning of a story of a fictional character named Willa Marie Simone, who was both an artist and a businesswoman. She was a feminist. And remember, she's not real, but as an influence, Faith Ringgold was using her mother and also herself in a lot of the development of this character. And the story is that she moves to Paris in early 20th century to try and get her art out there and be inspired by the art around her. And throughout all of these quilts in this series, she meets famous painters, she meets Matisse, and she meets other African Americans, Sojourner Truth. She meets a lot of different people, and those influence her and her stories. So through these quilts, she is reflecting her personal stories, obviously making them a little bit different because this is a fictional character, but she's using her own life in the stories that she creates. It's also highlighting struggles of women and within a culture that's male-dominated and also white-dominated. So she's kind of bringing about her own experiences and the experiences of this woman trying to come out into the world and make a name for herself. She's also playing around with some of the historical context of the European, the American experience, the fact that in the art world, it's mostly white men earlier on who get all of the exposure. And so all of those things are influencing this one individual who are highlighting and her family, even though there are bigger contextual things going on that are influencing the life of this woman. So she's trying to get you to think of that through this small story, this narrative. She also tries to rewrite the past and highlight biases, as I said, in the art world. So she's really has bigger, broader messages shown through the story of one person. Faith Ringgold also struggles to get her own work shown, especially considered quilting is that women's art. And there's also some history with the Underground Railroad having quilting and using that with symbols and secret messages quilted into quilts. So she's kind of tying all of these things together in her work. So here is an image of Faith Ringgold. Here are a couple of her other pieces. This one's called Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima? And there's lots of text in here, lots of images that are painted and then quilted in. In the same way here we have a lot of women that appear to be indigenous to some kind of tribal culture. I'm not really sure of the details, but then we also have what appears to be like a gallery gala opening down below with people dressed up in suits and ties. So she's getting you to think about some of those cultural norms in Western culture versus maybe other cultures, European culture versus African culture. And then I thought this was a nice thing to kind of tie in just to get you to think about. If you remember, I believe it was like 2 years ago, Beyonce and Jay-Z had a music video that they shot inside of the Louvre. And you can see here, we have with the Nike of Samothrace, they're shown. We also have in front of the Mona Lisa, portraits of them together in the space. And so it's just something to kind of think about. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background. She here is showing herself or a fictional character loosely based on her in the Louvre with all of the pieces that reflect mostly the history of white men creating artwork. And then once again, we have some artists in this modern interpretation kind of doing something similar. So just something to kind of think about when you do look at pop culture and contemporary artists and the way they relate to their spaces. All right, moving on. John Quick-to-See Smith is next. This work is known as Trade, but the full title is Trade, Gifts for Trading Land with White People. So going into it, there's a little bit of an aggressive take, which is definitely warranted in what she wants you to think about and look at when you see this work. And this is just a quote by her. Why won't you consider trading the land we handed over to you for these silly trinkets that so honor us? Sound like a bad deal? Well, that's the deal you gave us. So you can see and hear the emotion in her face in the words that she has there. So let's zoom in and take a look at this piece just a little bit closer. If we look at the painting down below, there's a lot of collage elements, newspaper clippings. Some of them are images, some of them are stories. And then we have this kind of aggressive, quick painting. There's dripping, a lot of red, some natural colors, but lots and lots of red going through it, and a very quick linear drawing of a canoe. Now, hanging above are many things that might be recognizable to you, especially if you're a sports fan. We have all kinds of depictions of Native Americans or Indians, as they were referred to, with different imagery. We have the common depictions of early Native Americans. We have toy tomahawks, all kinds of things that reflect the culture of Native Americans in this kind of cheap, trinkety way, as she describes. Not necessarily an authentic depiction of those people. So let's go out and talk about this piece a little more specifically. As I said, it's a collage. She's using clippings that both are historical to when the Europeans were coming and creating the New World, but then also she has more contemporary clippings that show some of the problems facing indigenous cultures, Native Americans today in reservations. So things like poverty, alcoholism, obesity, disease, lots and lots of things that have become problems on these reservations. And so she's getting you to kind of think about those things, the historical context and then what's happening contemporarily to Native Americans. The colors, bloodshed, makes you think of this kind of aggressive overtaking. And then the trinkets are really this demeaning treatment of a culture that still exists to this day. In a lot of cases, we're still using these inauthentic depictions of Native Americans and using them in a large cultural context in America. So kind of a rough thing to think about, but really something that's important, and she wants to kind of throw in your face and force you to think about. So she's critiquing the 500th anniversary of Columbus in the New World. This was something that was celebrated by a lot of people, and she is kind of going against that. In a lot of her work, she's expressing identity as an individual, but she's also expressing her cultural heritage and highlighting Native American experiences, which are often not highlighted in the art world. A little background on her: she's a descendant of the Shoshones, the Salish, and the Cree peoples, and she lives in the Flat Rock Reservation. She also, in addition to creating art, organizes a lot of shows for Native American artists. She feels that the art world really ignores art from Native Americans, so this is a way that she can help bring the art to the forefront. And then here are a lot of her other pieces. You can see there's similar cultural background. There's a lot of texture in the work, painting, collage in a lot of them. She's even using Leonardo's Vitruvian Man as part of a symbol. We see some things that might look almost like cave paintings used. So she's using a lot of references to kind of tie in what she wants you to think about in her work. All right, our last artist we're going to look at today is Shirin Neshat. This is called Rebellious Silence. So this is one picture from the Women of Allah series, and I'll show you some others on the next slide. If we look at the picture, we see it's a photograph. She did not take her own photographs, but then she did do the Farsi text that's written in calligraphy on the surface. So all of the photographs in this series are of Iranian women. They all have guns in them in different ways. They're all black and white, and text is written on all of them. Now, she did the writing of the Farsi text and the calligraphy painstakingly on the surface of these pieces. So this one's called Rebellious Silence, and the text on the surface is a poem about bravery of martyrs. I think it's important to note that this piece was done in 1994. A lot of people think that this was done after 9/11. It did receive a rebirth in the series. The importance of the subject kind of brought it back to life after 2001 for 9/11, but these were done pre-9/11. So she has the woman with a veil. She's looking directly out at the viewer, and a veil for a lot of people represents freedom, but it also represents oppression, depending on your cultural lens and how you're looking at the image, depending on your own beliefs about it. She's also talking about beauty next to violence. We're seeing a beautiful woman really standing up strong, and then we have this gun kind of dividing in the center. Couple more from the series here. You can see sometimes it's faces, but sometimes it's other body parts. She's examining the female identity of a woman from the Middle East, and it brings about thoughts about Western perceptions and prejudices, thinking about the veil, the choices of women to be conservative or to choose to go against that cultural belief. And she's reacting to government restrictions, which I'll talk more about what happens in context. So these works follow the Islamic Revolution. She was raised in Iran when it was more free for women to do what they chose. They had the choice of wearing a veil. But then she moves to California and returns to Iran post this Islamic Revolution and sees that things are very, very different and the role of women is restricted. And she's not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, but she wants you to think about that, the fact that the role of women has shifted so greatly in the couple decades she's gone. So the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which kind of shifts things, basically a restrictive government comes in and basically women are now required to wear the veil in public, and this is around the 70s. What's happening at the same time in Europe and America is this women's liberation movement. So it's something that she's kind of playing with, this yin and yang of these two different ideas about the role of women and the rules for women. And then I mentioned before, post 9/11, this work has more meaning. It's something that when you think about the backlash against Muslims in America, it makes you kind of rethink your own prejudices and your own beliefs based on those. And then just a couple more here. She is working on her calligraphy. You can see sometimes she doesn't use the text, but a lot of times she uses it to kind of bring this feminine, beautiful Islamic art into the photographs that she has taken. So that's all we have for today. We have a few more for tomorrow and for Wednesday. I look forward to talking to you then.